On October 17th, 2018, Justin Trudeau tweeted, "Profits out of the hands of criminals, protection for our kids. Today's cannabis is legalized and regulated across Canada." Many pro-cannabis advocates celebrated, thinking the hard part was over. Fast forward 995 days later, and here we are, still fighting many of the same battles as before. Today, I'm sitting down with two industry veterans who have firsthand experience of how infuriating, expensive, and difficult it is to operate a legal cannabis business here in British Columbia and more broadly in Canada. Joining me today is Jaclynn Pehota, Executive Director of the Association of Canadian Cannabis Retailers, and Matthew Greenwood, co-owner of Up Smoke, a local cannabis store in the Mount Pleasant neighborhood. Today we'll be exploring three main themes. One, the regulated market, challenges that companies like Up Smoke are facing as a compliant operator in this market. Two, the unregulated market, focusing on three subtopics, which are health, taxation, and public safety. And finally, we're going to touch on what I describe as some game changers that we need to see, and you'd like to see, around policies and solutions in order to create a healthier cannabis industry in Canada. So Jaclynn, Matthew, thanks for being on the show today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Now, before we get into the regulated market, just for the listeners to get a bit of a backdrop or backstory on who you are, why you're in this business, what you represent. Maybe Jaclynn will start with yourself as the Executive Director of the Canadian Cannabis Retailers Association.
Also known as ACCRES. That's our
ACCRES?
acronym. Yep.
Okay. So can you give us a quick 1-minute overview for both of you, please?
For sure. So my name is Jaclynn Pehota. I started working in the cannabis sector because my dad actually passed away of pancreatic cancer in 2014. So that introduced me into the world of medical cannabis. I actually come from telecom and insurance professionally. And through a series of near misses and unfortunate events, as it were, I started to work on the licensing side. So I have a consultancy that does federal production licensing and also retail provincial licensing. And through that work, I have garnered a significant understanding of the regulatory framework that we're dealing with. And I ended up meeting a great group of great people who were really interested in public advocacy on the retail side, and that is how I ended up as the executive director at the Association of Canadian Cannabis Retailers.
Okay, thank you for that. That's good.
My story's not as exciting as Jaclynn's. My day job is a commercial real estate agent with Remax Commercial Advantage. And one day I cold called a dispensary called Sunrise Wellness, and they became my clients for an additional location, as well as my friends. And now we're business partners. And so I have I prefer to smoke weed with my friends than have a whiskey, simply because I like the effects of cannabis, both the during and after effects, instead of having a nice bottle of scotch. I don't like the wake up in the morning. So I like cannabis for pain as well as social, and that's how I got into it, because I believe in it, and I think it's more suitable for social situations because it doesn't make us act crazy.
Well, that's a good introduction. Well, thank you for that. Let's talk about the regulated market, which is where you both spend your days. First of all, the Cannabis Act simply states that people can buy dry or fresh cannabis or cannabis oil from provincially licensed retailers. So my first question for you is, can you provide more context to what this line and the rest of the Cannabis Control and Licensing Act says? Because I understand there's been 12 additional enactments since 2018. I'll open that up there.
So basically what that means, Andrew, is that I have the right as a provincial licensee to buy from the provincial distributor, which is the BCLDB. Well, it's the BC Liquor and Cannabis branch now, so I got the acronym wrong.
Technically, they haven't changed their name yet.
Okay.
Wow, I got hit on the technicality. So what that means, Andrew, is that for any consumer that buys directly from the BC Cannabis Store right now, so if you're going on to bccannabisstore.com, don't go there, come to my store instead. Basically,
little plug for Up Smoke.
Yeah, thank you. Up Smoke's the best. But if you add a slash and you add wholesale, it's the same website. So that's where I buy all my weed. So my license allows me to buy that weed at wholesale prices and then keep it on my site, and only on my site. It cannot come off the site if it's not sold to the consumer. And I get to sell the weed, and that's it. Part of that license, though, is that there's a lot of compliance to it. So every gram of cannabis that comes into my store has to be tracked and submitted to the federal government. So that is a very onerous requirement, which is outlined in that term of your act.
And I think an important thing for your listeners to understand here is that there are two regulatory regimes that we're dealing with. So we're dealing with a federal regulatory regime, which is the Canadian Cannabis Act. So that covers production, processing, and sales to the distribution apparatuses that Matthew was talking to across the country largely. And then there's the BC Cannabis Act and also the Alberta Cannabis Act and the Ontario Cannabis Act. And each of one of those provincial acts specifically governs the distribution and retail sale of cannabis products. Also the marketing of cannabis products.
Okay.
If I may just jump in, the best way to explain that, as if you totally missed it, was this is the way I explain it to my customers, is the federal government tells you who grows it, the provincial government tells you who distributes it and who sells it, and the municipal government tells you where. So if that makes sense, the three level of self-government.
That's really that. I'd like that. Dumbing it down to the layman's terms. That's great.
Yep.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so then my next question is, walk us through the requirements to open a legal cannabis store in British Columbia today, because so far it sounds pretty easy.
There's 4 steps, Andrew.
Okay.
Step number 1 is to submit your paperwork along with your interest in real estate. Now, the interesting part about the interest in real estate is you will not know in the city of Vancouver unless you have the green zone, the unicorn green zone, which doesn't exist in Vancouver. So your listeners are aware, the development permit market, aka the municipal zoning in Vancouver, became a market in 2015. So since 2015, cannabis entrepreneurs have been taking stakes in 300-meter protected zones throughout Vancouver. So in 2021, when you're going to open a store, we're just going to use the Vancouver market. As in a store in Vancouver, then you need to find an area that has 300 meters distance from schools, community centers, daycares, halfway houses, and SROs and things of that ilk. And if you can't...
That must be pretty difficult.
Well, it's impossible.
There are only 92 addresses in all of Vancouver that comply with those requirements. All of them have other businesses on them, basically.
You then need to go to the Board of Variance to get the zoning, the MMRU zoning. Now, do you think any landlord in Vancouver is going to let entrepreneurial Matt get 6 to 8 months worth of free rent just to find out if he can get the zoning? Probably not, right? No, you're not going to advise your clients to let that happen.
Yeah, that's a huge cost to incur.
Exactly. So then I got to pay 80.
Especially if you don't even know if the answer is going to be yes.
Exactly. So no matter what, I got to pay 80 grand just for the ability to submit an application to the city of Vancouver to get the zoning.
Okay.
And then I go through what's called Board of Variance, and this wonderful woman beside me is the queen. Her and her husband Ian are the queen and king of the Board of Variance hearings. And then you do this song and dance to a board of citizens, not city planners. And if you're a citizen of Vancouver, this should make you so mad, because the people that are making planning decisions when it comes to cannabis retail in Vancouver, Ken Sim would love this, is the citizen. But the citizen review panel, it's called the Board of Variance. I think it's made up of 5 citizens.
It's 5 of them, yeah.
5 citizens will decide then and there whether your cannabis business can go forward. And the City of Vancouver planning won't really have a say in it. So that means that all this money we're paying to city planners through our property taxes, through all of our taxes, through our our utilities taxes, aren't actually being used by the City of Vancouver. Those assets that we're paying for is not being used to make this planning decision. Instead, the citizens have taken it upon themselves to decide which neighborhood gets weed because of the way that this policy is being written.
Okay. There's 3 things, right?
Yeah.
We just got that. That's just one. We got that.
There's 4.
There's 4. So now you're like,
That's 1.
Yeah.
So 1, you got to find a location.
Right.
Good luck.
Right. So now you're already into it. So for maybe 80 to 100 G's if you're in the city of Vancouver. Let's just use that number.
Okay.
Then you got your development permit. Yippee-ki-yay. Let's go to work. No. Now you've got to submit your 15-year work history, your 5-year spousal history, your 5-year address history, 2 years of financials, and all your whole.
But what if you don't have a business? Like if you're just starting.
Then how are you paying for this business? How did you just pay $100,000?
Oh, personal financials.
Yeah, like you.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, so you have to go through what they call fit and proper. So
this is with the provincial government.
So during and this is only after you've received the municipal approval. So remember, the timeline in your head is you're already 8 months into this application, and now you're getting into step 2, 3, 4.
Okay.
And step 2, 3 are kind of happen congruently, where they do the background check and they also do the fit and proper. So what happens is like.
But that I would think makes sense, that you don't want to have criminals running, like organized criminals running a legitimate cannabis business, right?
110%. By no means do I think that should happen.
Okay.
And I'm not criticizing that. What I am criticizing is the fact is it takes 6 months.
Right.
to do this diligence.
Right.
And the worst part is that for some reason, in my experience, that you go to two ministries at this point. You go to the Ministry of Finance, who audits your financials, and then you go to the Secretariat General, who is the top cop, and he goes through your background. And you will find in many instances that they ask the same questions.
Okay.
Because what tells you is that these two ministries, which represent a lot of taxpayer money, don't even have the systems in place to communicate
To talk to each other.
I think it's important to note for your listeners that the ministry responsible for the cannabis file is the Public Safety Ministry. So,
Which is Mike Farnworth's office.
Minister Farnworth
Right.
is our minister on this file.
Yeah.
He's a really nice man, really good guy. Just unfortunately, he's got to deal with COVID as well as a new industry. And one of the things that I always keep in mind when chatting with government officials is, they're regulating a $7 to $9 billion industry in this province, and they're trying to put paper on top of that.
Right.
When year after year, it's been doing this kind of revenue in the black market or the unregulated market.
Yeah.
So it's more like the problem that the regulator has is convincing these folks that their way is the right way.
Yeah.
And frankly, as you know, through sales, and the reason why we're having this conversation is that it hasn't really gone that way.
So so just to recap here for listeners. So one is getting municipal approval for a location. And this doesn't happen simultaneously. You got to get that first. So that's 8 to 9 months. Then you've got to go through fit and proper.
Yeah. And then you have an interview. So that's step 3. And then step
3 is the interview?
Yeah, you have to get the interview.
Is that part of fit and proper?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's the last one. But that's the scariest one, because then you have a senior investigator from the RCMP asking you questions.
Well, why is it scary?
I don't like the cops. I'm in the weed business. I don't like the regulator. Yeah. And still
But I mean, if you
guy.
got a clean record, you probably don't have much to worry about.
No, it's true, but they also look at your social media. So it doesn't matter. Like, say your best friend growing up fell in with the wrong people.
Yeah.
They will ask questions about that connection. I don't have any of that, but
Yeah.
I'm sure there's people that I've run into at events that I've posed
Yeah.
for photos that have turned out to be bad people.
Right.
And it's just the way it works. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know of
So
it.
you go through the interview.
And then after that, you have to build your store out.
Then you have to put up the money to build out the store.
And then you have to staff your store, and then you have to get your product in the door, and then you have your final inspection, and then you can finally turn the lights on.
Okay.
And your
So
final
a quick question for you here then, just to get an understanding of how long this takes, and this maybe Jaclynn is something for you to answer. When you look at the various retail operators out there, like Matthews, what's the fastest you've ever seen someone go from start to finish, going from making an application with the municipality they're wanting to set up in to actually selling cannabis? What's the average turnaround time?
In Vancouver, for a new applicant, I would say the average turnaround time, I tell people to build in between 12 and 18 months. That
12
is,
to 18 months.
yeah,
Wow.
that is my advice to people. In other jurisdictions, the land use is significantly less challenging. In
Yeah.
fact, we have the opposite problem in a lot of other jurisdictions where we have an overdensity of licensing. So in those jurisdictions, the land use is much less onerous. So you're looking at potentially between 6 and 8 months from a licensing process, and that's for a first-time applicant. That's really important to remember, because a second applicant, so if you've already gone through this process and you're opening a second store, you still have to go through this rigmarole, but it is obviously much faster because you hold a clearance provincially from a
Right.
security perspective.
I see.
So my second store will be a lot quicker.
I see.
But my first one took forever.
So what you can take away from what Matthew has said here is obviously this is a significant capital outlay, and you're holding real estate and you're in a revenue negative position for, almost a year in many cases, especially in Vancouver. And I mean, that puts you on a back foot as a business owner. I mean, when you open your doors in the environment that we're about to speak about,
Yeah.
ACCRES as an association, we represent 46 brands across BC, which is approximately 95 storefronts. And, I've heard again and again, regardless of jurisdiction, that, people open their doors into an environment where, they can't market and they're competing with a really sophisticated, unregulated apparatus. And having to hold real estate for that period of time is, very detrimental to the average entrepreneur.
Yeah, I got to assume that with all these barriers to entry, it only allows an opportunity for the well-funded to even get into this business.
Exactly.
Now, isn't there one of the rules is that you can't have more than 8 stores?
Correct.
And I'm assuming that was, if I recall, that was the reason for the NDP government choosing that, was they didn't want this to be controlled by one major or a couple major corporate groups from back east.
True.
But then at the same time, all of this additional layers of bureaucracy and costs kind of make it impossible for the average Joe or Jane or whoever's trying to set up a single shop to be able to set up in the first place.
To give you an idea of how hard it is
Yeah.
with the bureaucracy, in
Let's
my
hear it.
first year of business, I've paid the city of Vancouver $56,000 in city of Vancouver license fees.
$56,000.
And I have received no support from the BC government, none. And you're listening to this, David Eby and Mike Farnworth. You got my emails. I got no COVID support. All of it's done is just my business partners and myself bootstrapping the heck out of this.
Really?
Most cannabis businesses were excluded from any COVID relief. So, the wage subsidy programs, in many cases, CERB, because
Wage subsidy?
most people were not revenue positive in the
Oh,
2019.
right. Of course, it was based on right. Sure.
Which excluded not only retailers but also producers.
But we're $56,000 to the Vancouver
City of Vancouver business license fees.
$33,000 annually.
Where's the other?
So the $17,000 was paid in July, prorated when I opened.
Oh, I
and
see.
then in December, I had to pay them again $34,000.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's mid 2021. In your mind, should our government, and I'm just using the word government generically to talk about provincial, federal, municipal, should their focus today be on educating the market about the regulated industry versus unregulated, or should it be around enforcement of the unregulated market? Like if you could pick one or the other, education or enforcement, what would your choice be?
Can I answer that question?
Yeah.
We might both have different answers.
We might have different answers, but I'll go first if you don't mind.
Yep.
I would say historically, we can see that enforcement has been largely ineffective on this file. I mean, if enforcement was an effective measure, we wouldn't be having this conversation because cannabis would still be illegal. So to me, this is not a matter of, I think you have to remove yourself from the idea of legal, regulated, illegal, legal, and start to think about what we want to accomplish with legalizing cannabis. And so from my perspective, there is only an unregulated market because there is a market for that product. And so the consumer is in a position where they have been acquiring cannabis in a very, straightforward, potentially inexpensive way for a very long time, especially in British Columbia, because we have an extremely long history of unregulated access. So what we're doing here is we're attempting to change consumer behavior. Right? We are trying to push people into the regulated system. And I believe that a carrot is more effective than a stick. And I think that in this particular instance, there's a whole plethora of reasons that enforcement is fraught because, there is a medical apparatus that it goes along with cannabis that is outside of the recreational framework that carries a constitutional implication about right to access medicine. So that is very complicated. We don't want, gross. So to my mind, the best way to deal with this is to incentivize the public to change their consumption behavior, because as soon as that market goes away, I promise you the unregulated market will evaporate. Nobody is going to be selling cannabis in an environment where it's not profitable.
So I would actually second Jaclynn's point, because enforcement doesn't work for two reasons. And the most important reason is this, Andrew, is I do not get to be an entrepreneur in the cannabis industry, and I need my fellow entrepreneurs and peers to hear this, if it wasn't for the unregulated market and their advocacy and those brothers and sisters sitting in jail for weed crimes. Cannabis is a far better drug from a societal perspective than alcohol. Because you tell me how many people that drink a bottle of scotch at the Terminal City Club or whatever and crash their car and hurt somebody versus the guy who smokes a joint. He's not going to crash his car because he hasn't lost all his mobility nor his reaction time as much as an alcoholic has behind the wheel of a car. So the stigma around cannabis drives me crazy. And with education, the thing that the average consumer doesn't know is how many times there's a tax output from cannabis when it's bought. So my favorite thing to talk about is an ounce of weed. An ounce of weed in my store is $100. You heard that right, $100 ounces every day. $29 of that ounce alone goes to the federal government in excise tax. That's a 30% tax rate. Yeah. Find me an industry that gets taxed at that height. You can't.
What about the tobacco industry?
Not as big. Not on the output, because the tobacco isn't produced here.
Right.
The tobacco is produced over there. That's just the output for the excise tax on the cannabis. We're not talking about the GST and sales tax when it gets sold from the processor to the distributor, which then is taxed again when I buy it, and then it is taxed again when you buy it. which, you know, I think that's 4 taxes.
Right.
Cannabis plant plays by the time that it hits your lips and you're smoking it.
Yeah.
There's no other industry or no other real product in Canada that pays that amount of tax.
Amazing amount of tax. And I'm assuming that I have no idea what cannabis costs. You just mentioned $100 per ounce. I'm assuming with that added tax on it, it must make your product a lot more expensive.
It's actually included. That's the thing that's killing this industry is the process. The producer has to pay that tax as soon as they put the stamp.
Just to give the listeners a context, like what if I want to buy unregulated cannabis 1 ounce? What's the cost?
Anywhere from
Between $260 and $300.
Okay.
for quads though.
Yeah, that's for good stuff. So let's say you're looking at a compassion ounce, which would be something that you might like a cheap, inexpensive, between $160 and $180.
And a regulated product?
$100.
And the thing is,
Sorry, maybe I'm confused here. It sounds cheaper from yours.
Andrew, this podcast is the best opportunity that I have to tell all your listeners that I sell that price of product, because I cannot tell the public.
Because I was under the impression that regulated product is more expensive than unregulated.
Just because people haven't been in stores and nobody can let me tell my story. So when I get opportunities.
Okay, so if I want to go buy cannabis,
it's going to be cheaper.
It's cheaper if I go to your store.
Absolutely. And it's tested, regulated, and Health Canada approved, so there's no pesticides.
Well, that's a great segue into our second topic, which is the unregulated market. Did you want to say something, Jaclynn, before we jump to that?
I was going to say the specifically like that cost, I mean, is going to benefit everybody who buys it as well. Because when you buy that $160 ounce in the unregulated market, we don't capture any of that economic activity from a tax perspective. So, you know, when a consumer goes to Matthew's store and pays $100, you know, 29 of that is going towards public infrastructure. It's going towards public good, right?
Yeah.
Like that's the long and the short of the advantage. And the fact that we are not able to express that to the public is disturbing to me.
Are you allowed to advertise?
No.
You can't advertise?
No. Even what I just did by putting my price on your podcast, it is if a Health Canada official listens to this podcast, and I want it on your podcast, because I want your listeners to know this point too. If they listen and they decide that that's a problem, I'm going to get a letter.
Yeah.
Right. Well, for what it's worth, you're not advertising because you're not getting paid, and I'm not getting paid. We're all doing this for fun. So,
absolutely.
Okay, so that was a great segue though, Matthew, into the unregulated market. Mm-hmm. Let's maybe start. So there's 3 themes I want to talk about here. One is the health side. Then I want to go to taxation. And then I want to talk about public safety. So let's start with the health side of it. Is there a difference from a health perspective between unregulated and regulated cannabis?
I would say the difference, I don't want to speak to the health implications because we actually don't have any meaningful understanding about the health implications of, for instance, like combusting, like powdery mildew, which is a common contaminant in cannabis is. So what I will say instead is, from a health perspective, if you want to know what is going into your body, the regulated system is the place to purchase your cannabis. Because I mean,
and why is that?
From an unregulated perspective, there is no incentive from the person that is selling you that cannabis to be honest with you. In fact, they are incentivized to be potentially dishonest with you. Whereas in the regulated system, you have a very comprehensive set of test results, a very comprehensive set of results that tell you, A, what's in that product, like from a cannabinoid and a terpene perspective. So those are the 2 active components in cannabis. And then also it demonstrates that we have under, for instance, 5,000 parts per million contaminates on a biological level. So it's a very high standard. And you guys can have access to that information as a person from the public. Like you can go into Matthew's shop and say, hey, I'd like to see those test results potentially.
It's actually better than that. On your cannabis packaging, there's going to be a 1-800 number or an info@ email. If you info@ email and you want the COAs of that particular lot number.
What's a COA?
Certificate of Authenticity.
Okay.
Yeah, or certificate of analysis. Depends on who you ask.
Okay.
Seriously.
But this is helps. Like this is a tracking mechanism.
Yeah. This is test results by lot. So on your cannabis package, you'll notice that there's a lot number, a package number, and then all this contact information. Mm-hmm. And so when you email your producer, so say it's Aurora, you'll say Aurora Blue Dream lot number, whatever the 6 digits are, and then usually within 24 or 48 hours, somebody from that producer will send you back the test results of that lot number. Really? So you will know the chemical balance that's in it. So the terpene thing that we were talking about earlier, the terpenes are basically kind of like what takes your body on the THC effect. So everybody's going to act different with terpenes. So knowing your terpene profile is important, because then you'll know which cannabis works best with your body. And so this information is readily available to the consumer. All they have to do is email the producer. They can come to my shop, absolutely, but I have to do the same thing. And it's probably better, more efficient for them to email the producer themselves, because we'll do it, but like if you get your email wrong or your phone number wrong, then we're not going to get you the information. So
fundamentally, I would say it's like the ability to know what the caloric value of your food, for instance, right? Like, if you buy a cookie, it has a set of, information, content, ingredients, all those things that demonstrate to you that, yes, somebody has like paid attention to this. There's a quality assurance program in place, and this is exactly what you're getting. That is, to me, very appealing as a consumer. I mean, if you're cognizant about what you're putting into your body, knowing what that is like a huge selling point from my perspective. That being said, I will say that people have been consuming unregulated cannabis from an unregulated space for a very long time with, not a lot of health outcomes. That's the other consideration here, is that we don't have a lot of people getting sick. We don't have people dying. So it's a hard kind of conversation to have about the health, impact of what unregulated cannabis might actually have on you.
Yeah, put it this way. If you read the ingredients of every single item that you put in your grocery cart, then you have no business buying unregulated weed.
100%.
Because you care about what goes into your body. If you're
Right.
one of those people that eats at McDonald's every day and is like, yeah, Big Macs, then you probably don't care.
Right.
Because that's the level of interest that you have on your body.
Right.
And it really depends on the individual. I myself want to know that my weed doesn't have heavy metals, pesticides, or other contaminants.
I guess if we were to use a parallel to, say, the alcohol industry, if I go into Up and Smoke to your store, Matthew, and I buy my cannabis, it's like me walking into a private liquor store, buying a case of beer, and I know what's in that beer because there's a contents. Versus if I go to Uncle Buck's, moonshine that he's running out of his garage, versus buying from that store across the street that you were talking about, I don't know what I'm getting.
Yeah.
And it sounds like from what you've suggested, Jaclynn, it's not like there's a long history of laced or tainted marijuana or cannabis, but that is a potential concern or risk, right? Is that something can be in there. Maybe it's not as intentionally nasty, but as you pointed out, Matthew, something as simple as some kind of toxins that aren't intentionally in there, but because of the way the cannabis was grown in an unregulated environment. Where does unregulated cannabis grow in today? Like, if I were to go to the shop across the street from where yours is, where is that cannabis likely coming from? Coming from BC or other parts of the world?
Maple Ridge specifically.
Maple Ridge.
But yeah, it's definitely.
Are there any legal cannabis stores in Maple Ridge?
There are 3, I believe now: Spirit Leaf and Muse. Yeah. And I think that there's another one that's.
But Maple Ridge is like a big exporter of.
Well, Maple Ridge specifically has, I believe there are 5,000 medical licenses issued by Health Canada for growing for personal medical use or for as a designated grower, and a significant portion of them live in the Maple Ridge and Mission area.
Right.
I grew up there, so I can speak to this very
It's like
accurately.
the wine industry in the Okanagan. Maple Ridge has got this kind of artisan. Okay.
Maple Ridge, Comox Valley, the Green Mile is what we call it outside of Kelowna, and then Nelson. Those are the likely concentrated spots that they're coming from.
Right.
It depends on the person who is buying the cannabis, but one of the nice benefits of having unregulated space is that the supply chain is normally very short.
Right.
So that's nice.
Gotcha. Okay. Let's jump to taxation. How much of a net revenue loss do you think we're missing out here in BC because of the unregulated market?
So we have captured, it is estimated, of the consuming public in BC, which is potentially 30% of adults, between 18 and 22% of that market. And I believe we collected, was it $19 million in excise provincially on the cannabis file in 2019, I believe was 2019, because we haven't had 2020's budget come out yet. So, I mean, that is there we go. Let's do the math on that. So if we're capturing 20% of the market and
Divided by 0.8.
we brought up, we got $20 million out of that, we're missing $100 million or $80 million worth of potential excise revenue from a tax perspective if
80
we were
million.
to successfully capture. And that's only the excise tax. So that doesn't include PST, which would be, I did the math
7%,
recently,
yeah.
significant as well.
So
I
sorry,
mean,
do you have do you know roughly how much, I don't know what they call it, like street pricing value of cannabis is sold in BC?
Nobody
annually?
does.
There are a couple of estimates, though. There are some folks who've done some work on the unregulated market at an economic side, at an academic level, so they're not motivated. The problem with the numbers that the RCMP and Health Canada put into the public is that they're quite grossly inflated. So there's an estimate
What's
that
grossly inflated? How much is
the
being consumed?
value of the cannabis.
Oh, the
So
value.
every cannabis rate is worth like hundreds of thousands of dollars, when in
Right.
fact it probably isn't really worth that much money.
Okay.
Realistically
But just to
speaking.
simplify this, like again, going back to kind of layman's terms, like is our provincial government missing out on lost tax revenue because of this continued unchecked illegal cannabis industry?
Massively, and I also believe they're also losing money on their build out of the public store network, because there is a cannabis industry that we've been talking about, this unregulated cannabis industry that has existed for hundreds of years in British Columbia. Only a government would decide to not use the existing industry and build their own from the ground up. It makes zero sense to me. I understand the BC liquor file because of the end of Prohibition. They wanted to make sure that they controlled all the liquor sales in BC. Cannabis was never really prohibited because it wasn't. Like, there wasn't the same kind of the things that happened in the 20s to rum runners. And so instead of using the existing people that are already there and just getting them, on the right side of the law, they have decided to reinvent the wheel, build out massive stores, and spend a lot of our taxpayer dollars.
Yeah,
You're talking about, these are not stores like Up and Smoke. These are actually government built out and run stores.
They are called.
These are like the equivalent of like a BC liquor store.
Yeah, they're called the BC Cannabis Stores. There's currently 16 that are currently open, I believe. Or maybe it's 27 now.
27.
It's 27, but there's 200 coming to market. They have a great location in Metrotown, but they just can't open it because they just can't get it open. They can't get it approved or something.
And I think that what you can take away from what Matthew has just said is not only are we not maximizing the tax value of this sector, we're also, potentially expending public funds to create an infrastructure that is superfluous, right? Like we have.
So if we were to separate just the BC cannabis store network of 27 stores today, potentially going to 200, what you're suggesting, Matthew, is that those stores actually lose money?
Yes, and I would suggest that
We're not talking about the revenue they're generating from sales of cannabis from stores like yours, but if you look at that network,
they're losing money.
Is that information public?
No, and I would love the BC Liberal critic to stand up and ask these questions.
What about, just to finish off on taxation, what about like cafes, for example? Like, can you go to a cafe where you're allowed to smoke cannabis?
As the executive director and myself will happily tell you, not yet, but we're working on it. It's actually not a licensing issue as much as it is a work safe issue.
Oh, I see.
Because if you think about it, smoking, if you're going into a place to consume cannabis in a cannabis lounge, then the liability is on you walking into that room, right? The issue the issue that I've run into when thinking about the policy mechanisms on this is the work safe model, the people who are working in there serving the cannabis. It's the stigma around cannabis, Andrew, is it's madness, because you have a whole bunch of people who haven't tried the plant in years, making rules for people that trade the plant. And then they wonder why it's not working.
Yeah, it's a bit shocking that out of all places in the world, BC's government could screw up cannabis.
And a left-wing government at that.
Okay.
Again, greenfield.
When we talk to people like you and we see the dumbfounded look on your face, don't take it the wrong way. But like most people, the stigma that I face is most people think I'm a stupid stoner. I'm highly educated and I'm an entrepreneur that invested in this business.
Yeah.
What I am dealing with is like a big mafioso bully is what the government is.
Right.
Like the things like, like making a reasonable argument based on reason and fact does not skate in my industry with the regulator.
Really?
It is like the big green monster that is cannabis is going to steal their children. And I can tell you right now, as a father of two beautiful daughters, I would much prefer my children to use cannabis than alcohol. because a lot of the problems that have been happening and coming to light at UBC are derived from people putting what into people's alcoholic drinks. They're putting GHB and date rape drugs into 20-year-old girls' drinks, and they're taking them home. You know what doesn't happen? They don't get date raped if they smoke a joint.
Right.
There's no risk there. Now, I don't think it's fair that my daughters can't drink because of the risk associated with GHB. However, I, again, as a parent, would much rather my kids smoke weed with their friends than drink.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Matthew makes a really good point about stigma, because stigma continues to stifle this opportunity. And what's happening in Canada, in my opinion, is that we're losing our first mover advantage. We had an international opportunity with a brand, especially a provincial brand in BC, that is internationally famous. BC Bud is famous the world over. People, if you go to,
for sure it is.
So what we have done by over-regulating this scenario is not only are we squandering the domestic opportunity, we're also squandering our first mover advantage in an international market.
Right.
Which is, I mean, just baffling to me.
So on the theme though of like ancillary businesses or follow on, like look, when I grew up as a kid in the 80s in Port Alberni, it was a logging town. The local politicians would often talk about, you know, why it's important to support the mills, because they had spin-off businesses that would come from all the logging industry. In fact, that was a kind of this continual theme of why we shouldn't just export raw logs, that we should do value add. So is there other ways in which you could see here in BC, if the regulated market was more like if it was thriving, because I don't get the impression it's thriving today, there would be other types of industries or businesses that would benefit from that?
Absolutely. I mean, there's an opportunity here from a tourism perspective that is just being like, I don't know, just thrown it out, baby out with bathwater, goodbye. There is, you know, a model that exists right now in Amsterdam where you have consumption spaces that are also cafes that is world famous. It is international draw for tourism.
Right.
Until, you know, BC gets into that mindset where, you know, you can go to a space, buy the cannabis, and then consume it at the same time, there is no destination for that tourist, right? There is no reason for you to
This
pick.
is really smart.
Right?
I went to Dublin on a business trip, and I went to the Guinness factory.
Exactly.
And man, they probably spent easily, I don't know, $20-30 million in this facility for the tourists.
Yep.
And you pay a ticket, and it was expensive. You paid like $100, and you go in, you get a little taste of Guinness at the end. You see the tour and stuff. And their gift shop, they were just selling like crazy.
Yep.
Then I went to the Jameson whiskey place, the same thing. Is this the idea you're talking about?
That's exactly what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, you know, creating hubs that are destinations in the same way that you would have a winery as a destination or a craft brewery. And the thing that you had said right there about that gift shop.
This could really bring tourism to Maple Ridge.
Huge amounts of tourism, huge opportunity, because it's already happening. Why aren't we capturing the activity? And, you know, your comment about that swag that you can buy at the Guinness factory or the Jameson in the gift shop, again, lost to us, not available to cannabis retailers.
Wait a second, you can't sell swag? You can't sell an Aurora or Canopy t-shirts?
I cannot sell anything with any weed brand on it. My t-shirts would be great. I'd bring you an Up and Smoke t-shirt right now, because we call ourselves the meme dealers, because that's the only way we can advertise without getting our account closed on social media.
Are you serious?
Yeah, so we 100% do memes.
You're telling me you can't advertise? You can't make some t-shirts to say Up and Smoke? You can't co-brand like an Aurora Up and Smoke ball cap?
The only thing that I can do right now is accessories. So lighters, ashtrays, rolling paper, stuff like that. And to be frank with you, like, I would never do that because it cheapens my brand.
Sure.
Like, I want hats, t-shirts, hoodies, and like really comfortable sweatpants.
Yeah.
It's even kind of more unfair than that, because, I mean, let's say Matthew decided he wanted to give a significant donation to, I don't know, the food bank. The food bank is not allowed to tell anybody that he did that. They are not allowed to say, thank you, Up and Smoke, for this wonderful donation.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely not.
It's this, like, this is when you look at when you talk about the regulated cannabis industry in Canada, the reason why it's struggling is not because of the unregulated market. It kind of is, because they make better product, but it is because of the regulator and the regulations. Yeah. And the reality that, I don't care what angle you take on this, it will always end with the bottom line is this, is non-weed people made weed people rules. And instead of fixing them, they're making them more difficult.
Wow.
I mean, I can offer some context if you think it would be interesting to your listeners here, as to, you know, when Matthew talks about the regulatory burden and how that's holding the sector back. I would agree with you 100% that, you know, that regulatory burden is far more detrimental to legal cannabis than the unregulated market is. And the reason that we're there is because twofold. So first of all, the Cannabis Act, federally, the one that governs the production that we talked about, was the product of taking an old medical act that treated cannabis, like a natural health product. So not like a consumer product like beer or wine, but rather like, you know, Jameson products that you would get from the Shoppers Drug Mart as a, you know, St. John's wort or whatever. And so medical framework gets transitioned into a recreational framework without any consideration to the fact that we're not dealing with immunocompromised people. We're not dealing with people who have cancer or, you know, other challenges. We're dealing with you and me and you. We're all, you know, immune people, and the like our immune systems are fine and dandy, and the regulations don't take that into consideration. And if you look at the regulations in other jurisdictions for recreational cannabis that have that available to them, I'm thinking of specifically Colorado and Washington and Portland, or Oregon rather, we don't see anything like the level of onerous requirement for processing of this product. Fundamentally, cannabis is more akin to tomatoes than it is to aspirin, right? In its raw form, right? Like as a consumer good, it is, you know, it's perishable. Its quality depends on its freshness and the way that you handle the product. And our regulations don't take any of that into consideration. They, in fact, you know, create a scenario wherein we are detrimental to the quality of that product. And when Matthew talks about, you know, it's better quality in the unregulated market, a huge portion of that is the regulatory burden. It has nothing to do per se with, you know, the ability to grow in a regulated space. It's what happens to that product after they pull it off the plant that becomes horrifying. And I think that, you know, that is something that, you know, we did because, you know, there was hesitance. This was a new file. We were first internationally to make this move to towards legalization. So I appreciate that cautiousness.
You mean Canada?
Canada, yes.
Yeah.
You know, I appreciate the cautiousness on the part of the regulator. However, like, we have demonstrated that we can safely sell this product.
Well, we're 3 years past. Like,
3 years in. No one's dead. You know, there's not piles of bodies lying in the street. What are we really trying to mitigate here in terms of risk? To me, the only thing that we're doing here is, you know, dampening the economic opportunity.
Absolutely. We should be exporting cannabis around the world right now. Our growers should be celebrated as the number 1 growers in the world for cannabis.
Yeah.
And like right now, I think we only have 2 export markets, and that's Israel and Portugal.
I think the UK takes stuff from us,
but
and Germany.
It's a
Israel,
really good point that we don't even export, and there must be other jurisdictions in the world that would easily take our cannabis.
It's madness when you sit here and you think about the natural resource development that we do. We cut down 200, 400-year-old trees. We could be cutting down 4-month plant cycles.
Right?
We're never going to grow the damn tree back in my lifetime, your lifetime, anybody's lifetime.
Yeah.
That plant, though,
It's a really good point.
Yeah, I could grow 3 of them in a year.
Well, and that's a very good point, because we're missing
That's
an
a great
opportunity
point.
for carbon capture. Can you imagine if
Sure.
you sequestered, like, if you're growing 100,000 square feet of cannabis, it's biomass, it's sequestering carbon. If you dispose of that biomass properly after you've taken the flower off the plant, you've just buried, you know, 400 tons of carbon into the ground.
Right.
Like, and we're missing those
I'm still
opportunities.
blown away that you can't advertise. Like, I'm thinking about, like, Canadian oil sands, Husky Energy, who are having like these. I mean, I'm not trying to take a position on pipelines or not here, but just like, you know, you want to talk about environmental impact. They can advertise on, you know, hockey night in Canada, but you can't have a T-shirt. Let me ask you something else here, guys.
Go ahead.
This is my last question on taxation.
Yeah.
Is there an indirect way for government to effectively tax profits on illegal cannabis operators? I'll repeat it one more time. Is there an indirect way, in your mind, that the government could effectively tax the profits on illegal operators?
So you're asking illegal operators to self-report their revenues?
No. I'm asking if you've got any ideas and creative ways to. Here, let me give you an example, okay? Because I had one of my own, and this one I came up with like 10 years ago,
okay,
back when, way before anybody was even talking about having legal cannabis. I said, it was a huge industry in Canada, in BC, it still is. And I thought, well, why don't we, so what do cannabis operators need to operate? Well, they need hydroponic equipment.
Yeah.
And so I thought, well, why don't we just have a massive tax on hydroponic equipment? And unless you can prove that you are like a tomato grower or a cucumber grower, and therefore you can at least, for a one-time sale, charge like a 200% premium on that hydroponic equipment. And therefore, your illegal operators, arguably, unless they're trying to try and illegally import this hydroponic equipment, will pay it because they've got such huge profits to make anyways. And now you're in an indirect way, you're taxing the illegal market. So I'm just wondering, is there any kind of way that you could tax the illegal market?
I have an idea of how you might consider that. I mean, I don't know if you could you call it a tax, but the reason, for everybody's edification, that we have such a culture of cannabis cultivation in BC, does anybody know the answer to why?
No.
So there's two reasons. So first reason is draft dodgers. So everybody from California came up in the 60s and brought all their sweet, sweet seeds with them.
Right.
And second reason is
Salt Spring Island.
Yeah, exactly.
And Maple Ridge, apparently.
Tuxedo, right?
Yeah.
Tuxedo, Maple Ridge, potentially. Comox Valley. And then the other one is cheap hydro. So it is
Right.
inexpensive from an electricity
There you go.
perspective. Same thing in Quebec. So our two specific hubs of unregulated cannabis production in this country are the two places that have very
Right.
inexpensive electricity. So, I mean,
That's a creative one. So you could effectively just jack up your hydro rates
If you go
on
over a
places
certain
that you
number.
know are basically running grow ops.
Or more to that, you could use the hydro accounts, the ones that are running high in houses, then you'll know it's a grow op. So instead of just taxing them through the hydro bill, you could probably physically show up to the address and you would know it's there, and you could the government or the regulator could have a very frank conversation.
so let's talk
Then
about.
that gets into the enforcement.
I wouldn't say it was enforcement, because you're asking me how to capture tax.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, so like I wouldn't say that you go there as an enforcement agent. I'd say you go there and say you're clearly doing an illegal business. Now, let's play some taxes. Like, here's a GST number, because that is what happened to retailers prior to legalization. Is the city of
However,
Vancouver,
just to be a devil's advocate, if you did that, now you're allowing someone to run an illegal business comfortably by just paying the tax. Anyways, okay, it's a tough one. Like, it's
One other consideration here with my suggestion, just for everybody's edification, is that many people grow cannabis under Health Canada licenses that are government issued for personal medical use. So how would you differentiate between those people with their high hydro bills potentially, and then people who are diverting, which is what we call selling into the unregulated market? And that's a big challenge.
And that's the big piece of the unregulated market, is the acronym better than me, but is those licenses.
Yeah.
Those licenses are a big deal.
And
Is that a big part of the supply side of the illegal market? Is these people who have they have the legal right to grow 500 plants?
diversion has traditionally been a challenge with unregulated. That's what they call.
What's diversion?
Diversion is the taking the excess product from your medical license and selling it to other people that are covered by your license.
Yeah, of course. Because, I mean, like, what fool would think that someone who's growing their own medical marijuana in their home and has too much of it is going to just throw the rest in the compost? They're going to sell it for sure, right?
And what we need
if
to
you're
do-
you're a fool if you think they're not.
We need to create a situation where they can sell it legally to medical patients. That's the long and the short of it,
It's
right?
like having a solar power panel on your roof and supplying BC Hydro with your excess electricity.
Mm-hmm.
Let's now go to the public safety side.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Now I'm going to reference two tweets, and then I'll like to get your comments. Now the first one is the one we have here from Justin Trudeau, because he says, "Profits out of the hands of criminals. Protection for kids. Today's cannabis is legalized and regulated across Canada." Classic Justin Trudeau, waves his magic wand and the world becomes a perfect place. That was 2018. 3 days ago, the Surrey RCMP quoted, "Buying illegal cannabis puts money into the hands of criminals." And they put this picture, and you see guns, drugs, money. And I went into their press release, and they went on to say that the RCMP's gang and drug enforcement units in Surrey, in 2 days, in late June, this is very recently, they seized 5 bricks of hashish, 1,250 THC-infused butter containers, 2 boxes of edible cannabis products, over 1,100 preloaded cannabis vape pens, nearly 8,000 cannabis clone plants, 33 kilograms of prepackaged dried cannabis, over $65,000 in cash, 5 firearms, and 2 handguns. Mm-hmm. Like, let that thing sink in for a second. 5 firearms and 2 handguns. Now, the irony of this, it's in friggin' Surrey. How many legal stores are there in Surrey?
Thanks, Doug McCallum. There's 0.
0. So if people don't think that illegal cannabis isn't falling into the hands of gangsters and criminals that are dangerous, I'm not talking about the person who's got a license to grow some cannabis in their greenhouse in the back door who's a peaceful, law-abiding citizen. I'm talking about gangsters, people who have guns and are using this as a means to generate profits and create pain in our society. So on that note, you can hear my tone and you can get my sense of where I come from on this. How do you think the government's doing with respect to enforcement of this market?
I'm going to answer that question with a story of my own, if you don't mind.
Please.
So I started in residential real estate about 8 years ago. One of my first managing brokers, I'm not going to name him, just because he didn't ever want me to name him in this story, called me the other day and said, Matt, I need your help. And I go, what's up? He's like, well, my kids are buying weed. And I'm like, how are they buying weed? It's legal. Like, they have to be 19. Well, apparently they're buying it off a website and they're delivering it to their high school parking lot. So no.
So these are kids that are under the age of 18.
These are high school age children who are buying weed on their smartphones in the bathrooms of their high school, and they are then getting the weed delivered in the staff parking lot of said high school. That would never happen with me, because you get ID'd if you walk into my store. If you look under the age of 21 for sure. If you look under the age of 25, you get ID'd. Whereas there's no ID. So yeah, there is no accountability. There is no desire to follow the rules if you're buying your weed through gentlemen like those referenced in Surrey. And furthermore, there's no labels on that product, and there's no health, there's no testing. So you don't know what you're getting.
And you don't know what the source is fundamentally, because I mean, you don't know who the person, providing that cannabis to you as somebody who's buying from the unregulated market, where they are and where they're from. You don't know if they're, a law-abiding citizen who's a mom and whatever, or if there's somebody with 2 handguns in their back pocket. Right. And that on that list of things, the handguns are the thing that, like the guns, the firearms generally are the thing that really concerns me, because, part of the triumph of cannabis and the history of cannabis in Canada is that the successful regulation of the medical market really diminished what we're talking about here. And we're seeing a resurgence happen post-legalization. How did we get...
that's the craziest part of this. It's like I said earlier, I think, I used your quote, which is, how can the BC government screw this up so much? I mean, like, we're seeing like hard criminals, dangerous criminals, like thrive in a market where it appears to me there's virtually no enforcement. What does, out of interest, because you said there's an illegal store across...
Not anymore, it's gone now.
But what does enforcement look like today? Or is there any?
To be honest with you, Andrew, I never personally witnessed it, because I was terrified. Because, you've just posted a photo, and that was the reality that I dealt with for 8 months, thinking that was what it was across the street from me. So if you think, a man with 2 daughters and 2 business partners and a beautiful wife, if you think I was going to go risk that just to make more money, no. So I have no idea.
So this has got to be solely in the hands of the government. This is their responsibility.
CSU, this is the Community Safety Unit is what they're called. Okay. And from my understanding...
How much power do they wield?
Do you have nothing?
Oh.
Nothing? A wet noodle worth of power? Like, I can slap you with spaghetti. That's the CSU. That's what they can do. Or they can write you a fine.
Hot takes over here.
Oh, I'm so frustrated.
So wait a second. You're telling me that the police are not... I mean, other than this kind of activity, which is really... You're telling me that an illegal cannabis store is unlikely to get a visit from the police?
They'll get what it's called is an educational visit. I'm air quoting, educational. I don't know what it means. But basically it means that they walk in there, they say, knock, knock, you can't do this. Mm-hmm. Then they have to come back. They have to witness and whatnot. So I'm not exactly sure how it works. I never stuck my nose in to really figure it out because, again, I just didn't want that threat.
Of course.
But I can tell you that the CSU comes and then the VPD supports, because the VPD is the only one that can take proceeds of crime. This is the kicker. The CSU cannot confiscate.
What's this stand for again?
Community Safety Unit.
I think it's important for your listeners to understand how enforcement, like what the mechanisms of enforcement are. So as Matthew had mentioned, he's got this store across the street. So how does the CSU know about that, right? How do they know that there's an unregulated store? It's up to the public to call and say, hey, there's an unregulated store. So let's say there's, an operator who, they're beloved in the neighborhood and nobody ever calls. They will continue to tick along as they always have with no concern or consideration from our provincial government. And the reason that is, I think that we need to frame this very carefully, is that, there was an impulse on the part of this, this elected apparatus, this government, to allow for a transitional period so that we could capture people like your business partners, people who were working in the medical market and they were going to transition into a regulated framework, and then that was going to be a success.
Yeah, they're not dangerous criminals.
No.
These are people who want to do good. They want to pay taxes. They want to run a business.
I want to give you an idea of who my business partners are, because they are unregulated and they've been called that, but they're not just unregulated. And this is my business partners' names are Dominic and Maximilian. And I need you to know that they were so good at what they did that people would travel from all over BC to buy their medical cannabis from my business partners. These gentlemen won awards for what they did for the cannabis community. And they were locked out of this industry for a year and a half by the provincial government. Meanwhile, big companies that had never touched cannabis at all and were opportunistic stole that from them. And so now me and my business partners, Maximilian and Dominic, are fighting an uphill battle where we can't advertise. And these big companies can just take locations and just basically throw their financial might around. Whereas the people who carried this across the line are left out in the cold. And the worst part for me is that these big companies that are winning right now, they're nana boo-booing these people that are on the sidelines. And the only reason why they get to eat in the sun is because these people sacrifice their lives.
Right.
So I'm pretty frustrated by that
I
point.
can hear that, yeah, for sure.
Well, you can never forget where you came from. You came from Port Alberni. You'll never forget that sailor culture. You came from Maple Ridge. You'll never forget the Ridge. I came from the island. I'm so laid back.
Where in the island are you from?
Victoria.
Oh, from Victoria.
I'm wearing sweatpants. You can't tell, but I'm wearing sweatpants and this weird kind of Big Lebowski shirt. So I'm laid back for life.
Are there any incentives for illegal operators to turn to becoming a legal operator?
The regulatory burden is so high, and this is another very interesting thing for your listeners' edification, is access to business services is non-existent for cannabis professionals. And that includes people who are licensed retailers and federally licensed as producers. There is no option for Matthew to go into his bank and ask them for a line of credit. There is no option for Matthew to go into his bank and ask them for a loan.
Wait a second. As a legal operator, you
I can't get favorable terms on a business loan. I cannot. I'll
who do
pay
legal operators borrow from?
Nobody.
Bank of Mom and Dad, and then other big asset
Private
groups.
placements.
But this goes back to your point, Matthew, which is these barriers to entry really only make the environment something that a well-financed group could get into.
Yeah, and exactly.
Okay, so starting July 15th, 2021, which is next week, legal cannabis operators are allowed to deliver directly to buyers. So how will this impact your business, and how will it impact the illegal market?
Well, it will be great. I probably shouldn't say this, depending on who's listening to your podcast, but you know what I don't have on July 15th?
What's that?
Insurance. Do you know what the BC government didn't do, Andrew? Talk to the insurance industry. So no underwriter is willing to give me insurance. So you know what that means?
No.
That means that I'm delivering the weed.
Personally,
I will. If you order weed from Up and Smoke after July 15th, and I hope you hear this, myself, Maximilian, or Dominic will deliver the weed to your door, because we cannot get liability insurance for anybody else to do it. It does not exist. I have an email from my underwriter in my phone right now that says all 4 major underwriters for this type of insurance refuses to insure this.
yeah. And the reason for that is that this entire sector has been designated high risk by our financial oversight bodies, right? What FinTrack, it's not called FinTrack anymore, but the organization that is FinTrack now has designated the entire sector high risk. And so that means insurance and financial services are largely lost to us. So what we have done here is we've, successfully, through a lot of advocacy work on the part of my association and other people in the market, we went to government, we made a very strong case for delivery and how it would be a tool for Matthew to compete with the unregulated market, create a space where we're competing on convenience, which is a big pillar of consumer, purchasing decisions. And instead of, this being a boon to the retailers, et cetera, they're in a position where they can't launch the program because there aren't services to support it. So, it's kind of a bridge to nowhere. Mm-hmm. If you're going to give me a tool, that's great. But if it's broken or, it's missing if you have me a hammer without the head on it, I'm kind of still screwed. And that's the challenge that we face here, right?
This is amazing. This is really amazing.
You want part 2? I can give you part 2.
Let's hear it.
No, you give me 6 months, and I'll have part 2 for you. Honestly, okay. Here's
so. Let me ask you this: there's delivery,
mm-hmm.
but the other part that I've heard about is being able to actually deliver your cannabis. Apparently, the illegal operators are actually delivering it through FedEx or through Canada Post.
We can't do that.
But is that happening? Can you validate whether that's happening or not?
It's absolutely happening.
So the unregulated market does it.
Yeah.
The BC Cannabis Store can do it.
Mm-hmm.
So if you buy from the BC Cannabis website as a consumer, you get it to your local post office. The way the policy was just released is
Are you serious? Okay, so let me just stop here for a second. Make sure this is clear. So you got Up in Smoke.
Yep.
And then you got this lethargic, overrun BC Cannabis Store.
Yes.
I go online, I check out your website. There's no button for me to click to have it sent to my home.
No.
But I can go onto the BC provincial government's cannabis site and they can have it delivered to my home.
Yes, they have a monopoly on online sales.
Mail order, specifically.
Mail order.
Yeah, you can do click and collect, which is basically you go on my website, you buy your weed, and then you come to the shop and pick it up. You show me your ID and your credit card that you paid for it with, and you can take it.
Mm-hmm.
As of, obviously, July 15th, I will be able to deliver it to your door. But, yeah.
Not by mail, though. There's a lot of foibles that come with by mail delivery. And it's very popular in the unregulated market. You can buy, BC cannabis in Ontario right now and have it mailed to you via Canada Post. Canada Post actually recently came out with a new series of smell-proof bubble envelopes. So I suspect that they might know that unregulated cannabis makes up a significant part
This is crazy. So can you at least, if you're going to be delivering cannabis to my home, and you're driving in your car, can you at least, expense the cost of your vehicle to deliver your cannabis to me?
I wish. No, because unfortunately, the way the policy is written is the company needs to own or lease the vehicle. So as a small business person, I have a car. Why can't I just use my car? What's the big deal? No, I need to have a legal piece of paper that says that this car is now leased to my company. And
so you have to go out and buy your own car or lease your own car through the company?
Yeah. I can't just use my own vehicle. I can't use my e-bike or my skateboard. I have to use a company-owned and insured vehicle.
To wrap this up, I want to talk about policies and solutions because it's obvious to me, it doesn't seem like it take much to come up with some just very simple solutions. We've talked about a bunch of them already. But can you highlight for me, Matthew, Jaclynn, some really sort of good ideas that you think this either provincial government or the federal government, wherever you, or municipal, but municipal is tough because every municipality is different. But if you think about the provincial government, is there anything that they could kind of do in the next 6 months to really change this industry to make it and I call it a healthier industry where maybe the small operators that are making it for themselves and their friends can carry on, that legal operators like yourself have a better fighting chance of success, and that these criminals, these dangerous criminals, get pushed aside?
So my answer to that question is actually really easy. So my focuses would be two on federal and a little bit on provincial. The two biggest things for me right now is let me show what my store looks like inside. So like right now I have what's called window opaquing, which means you cannot see into my store. So if you stand outside of my store, you might think it's like a porno shop or something kind of untowards. If you actually walk into it, you'll find that it's got high ceilings, beautiful lighting, really well laid out. There's some really cool videos playing. The music's always on point, and the staff are really friendly. But if you stand outside of my shop, you have no idea. It's just another weed shop. You don't know. So I would love the ability for the average consumer walking past Broadway in Alberta to look into my shop and see it's really nice inside, and it's totally worth checking out.
And you can't do that?
No, as a matter of fact, I got a ticket for that. We pulled off some of our window opaquing because people were like, what's in here?
And that's a federal regulation?
That's a federal regulation. Okay. The next thing is the 30-gram cannabis limit. So currently you can only buy up to 30 grams of weed in one transaction. But if you wanted to go to the liquor store today and you wanted to buy, like, I don't know, that 100-pack of Pabst Blue Ribbon, no problem. Mm-hmm. So why is it that you regulate the volume of cannabis sold, but you don't regulate the amount of alcohol? Because if Joe Public took home that 100 beers and he took it all in a night, I mean, first of all, he's probably dead. And second of all, he's probably caused a lot of damage. Whereas if he took the same equivalency in cannabis home, I can guarantee you there is no way that he got past joint 5.
To give some context for people like myself who don't consume cannabis, what is 30 ounces equivalent?
30 grams is an ounce of cannabis.
But what does that mean? Like in a form of a joint? How many joints do I get out of 30 grams?
So I would say the average...
Bombers or what?
Well, I'd say the average joint is a half gram, right?
Yeah.
So
Okay.
then you're looking at, out of 28 grams, which is an ounce, you'd be looking at 56.
Yeah.
Okay.
56 joints. And
Yeah.
so basically in cannabis, there's 1 gram, 3.5, 7 grams, 14 grams, and 28 grams. That is kind of like how the packages is broke up. It's a lot
see.
like tall cans, 6 packs,
I see.
12 packs, 24s.
And so no matter what combination, when I go into your store, I can't buy more than 30 grams.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And it's even,
but like you said, if I want to go to the liquor store because I'm hosting a big party, a big Super Bowl party, I can buy as much beer as I want.
You can fill up your truck and then get another truck.
and I
right.
think it's important to remember
So-
that we're not just talking about dried flower. That 30 grams is also, there's an equivalency that goes along with drinks and oils, etc., that is very, very, like, all over the place. There is...
So here's a
So,
great
so you had 3. You had two federal.
and then the
so,
thing provincially would
so those are the 2 federal one, which is the opaquing of your windows and the maximum sale of 30 grams.
yeah.
Okay. What's the provincial one?
Direct distribution. So what that means?
What does that mean?
So, like, we didn't talk about this, but cannabis is like craft beer. So if you're listening to this and you're a huge craft beer nerd, you know that fresh is best. Like, you don't want 6-month-old yellow dog. You want 2-week-old yellow dog because it goes stale, right? Because the active yeast eats it and whatever. Same thing happens with cannabis. So when cannabis is all being sent to a central distribution center, as it is in Delta, first of all, it's not getting rotated like it should. It's just not. So you're not necessarily getting the freshest cannabis when you buy it, right? Whereas direct distribution is just like craft beer. It allows me as a private retailer to call, Amanda's Grow Op and say, Amanda, I want a pound of Blue Dream put into 7-gram bags this month. Amanda can fulfill that for me and send it directly to me, and it's probably a month old, and it's fresh, and it's hand trimmed, and it looks beautiful, and it's worth $65 the quarter. Whereas
And why can't you do that today?
this is just the way the rules are.
Yeah, right now they're forced to buy from a central distributor who is also their competitor, what we were talking about with those BC Cannabis Stores. So essentially what we've done is we've...
But is that any different than liquor sales, being a private liquor store and
Yes,
liquor store?
yes and no. So it is. So when I first got into this industry, I come from commercial real estate, so I knew right away that the measuring stick was private liquor. Mm-hmm. That is it. That is your stalking horse. So private liquor took about 50 years on policy initiatives to change what we have changed in the last 2 years. Mm-hmm. So craft brewers are allowed to buy, like a craft beer like Brewery Creek on 16th and Main, they buy all their beer from like the distributor, not from the LDB, but the craft beer distributor.
Right.
And it's going to be the same thing in cannabis. So for anybody listening who's wondering, like, how do I invest in cannabis or where should I put my money? Just look at the craft beer market and look how that changed. And you saw that like Parallel 49 now leads the craft beer market in Vancouver, just like Phillips does in Victoria.
Right.
But you knew about them 10 years ago if you gave a care about beer. And it's the same with cannabis. The people that are killing it right now, the people that I can't keep on the shelves, are the people that are going to be killing it in 10 years. Mm-hmm. Your Aurora, your Canopy, your Hexo investments, they're just not it.
Right. All right. How about yourself, Jaclynn? Any ideas beyond the ones that Matthew's just proposed? Matthew, you're into this, man.
I love weed. Like, weed is...
I love your body language right now. I can tell you're passionate about this.
Well, I said it to you earlier. I don't want to cut down 450-year-old trees anymore, Andrew. I'm sorry, but I want my girls to run through them with their children. And it's selfish of us to think that it's the way forward.
Amen. That's a good one. That's been a really good point. Yeah. Jaclynn, how about yourself? Is there any policies that you're advocating, ACCRES is advocating for, changes that you could see at the provincial or federal level that would make operators like Matthew be able to have a bit more of a chance of success?
Well, I'll do 3 as well, since you did 3. Let's start with provincial. So consumption lounges are perfect. Like, that would be a very easy, very straightforward way for our government to, entice people into the regulated market, give people safe spaces to, use cannabis in the same way that we give people who are at the bar a safe space to consume alcohol. So that would be one that I would immediately change, because like I said, as we said before, from a tourism perspective, it opens up a huge opportunity. These are in addition to what Matthew has already said. And then federally, I would say most critically would be to, as I enumerated in a very granular way earlier, fix the medical system. Because all of the problems that we see here when we're talking about the unregulated market go back to that dysfunctional medical system. And it would be very straightforward for our government to look at that medical system and say, okay, here are the provisos that were laid out in the decision by Judge Phelan, and we're going to tick, 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 tick. Great. That would create a situation wherein people would have reasonable access to medical cannabis, and then they wouldn't necessarily need to grow their own all the time. Right? So, and then, if we were to remove that medical component from this conversation, what we would be left with would be people who were, interested in doing this activity as an economic, as a business or what have you, and then we can have a conversation about how we actively, get rid of those folks. Until we make that differentiation, our government's hands are tied. Mm-hmm. That's my genuine belief here, because, what has happened historically on this file is that enforcement happens, and then the federal government gets sued, and then the courts side with the medical patients, and then we're all set back. So that's another thing that I would say very profoundly. And then finally, I would say that I think it would be very judicious of our government to move this file from a public safety domain into an economic development framework. So right now, Health Canada and the Ministry of Public Safety, their mandate is not job creation. Their mandate is not economic development. Their mandate is protecting the public. They're protecting the public from a risk that nobody has quantified. I come from an insurance background, so mitigating risk means you have to define the risk first.
Sure.
But,
this is a really important point I think you're getting to, especially post-COVID, with how bad the economy's been, how much revenue we got to create some economic activity here in this country.
And we've officially come to a place where our forests are no longer carbon neutral. They are now, because of the impact that the forest fires and bugs and all those things have had on our lumber industry, we're no longer carbon neutral on that front. So, we have to accept the fact that we're going to have to pay the piper eventually. This is a consumer good that people love. They buy it hand over fist. It goes up in sales when we're having an economic downturn. So ironically, it's recession proof. And unless we start looking at the sector like that, we're going to continue to spin our wheels. Because if you hand a public safety mandate to Health Canada, they're going to regulate you up into the...
Yeah.
And the biggest thing I think, and this is what I like to say to people, is to sum up what's wrong with the industry is the suit took away the plant from the hippie. And that's what we have done.
And no offense to guys in suits, but...
Hey, I wear a suit half the week. I just don't like them. They're just too tight on me. I went to private school, so I was always wearing ties.
Choking to death.
Oh, yeah. I'm so done with it. And if I don't have to wear them anywhere, I won't. And that's what it comes down to for me. This can be a very healthy, happy, great industry for Canadians, for taxpayers, and for our future.
Yeah.
And all we have to do is harness it. And we haven't harnessed it. And nobody in the public sphere cares enough. Because what's happening right now, and it goes back to your public education piece, is weed. Okay? It doesn't matter if it comes from a government-related container, government-regulated container, or the Ziploc bag from your homie. Weed is weed. And as long as those opportunities exist, people are going to probably go back to their friend instead of me, simply because, as Jaclynn already said, is human behavior, and it's laziness, and it's buying patterns. Like, you probably still go to your same tailor that you've gone for 10 years. He might change his style, but you're loyal to him because he does a good job.
Right, yeah.
That's all there is to it.
Well, this has been great. This has been highly educating for me, and I have to admit, my mind's been blown up here with some of the stuff you've had to deal with. Like, I'm impressed that you guys are still running your business, considering all the hurdles you have to go over.
I had a baby this year too.
Let's not forget. And we're talking about an unregulated operator literally across the street from this gentleman.
Yeah,
You could have
that's
thrown a
incredible.
rock through their window.
Yeah, good for you. Jaclynn Pehota, you're the executive director for ACCRES. Matthew Greenwood, one of the co-founders and owners of Up and Smoke. Thank you for talking about cannabis with me today on the show. It looks like there's lots of work to be done ahead. Hopefully you'll get some cooperation from these provincial government, and maybe we'll chat again in 6 months. So thanks for being on the show today.
No worries. Thank you
Thanks
very
for
much.
having us.